The morning Lily called her father from behind the oak tree, the sky above Manhattan was the kind of pale gold that made everything look safer than it was. She pressed herself close to the rough bark, close enough to feel it through the back of her uniform cardigan, and kept her voice low. Not frightened exactly, something quieter than frightened, and in some ways harder to hear. Daddy, she's back. This is the third morning. On the other end of the line, Thomas Caldwell went still. Not the stillness of a man who hadn't heard. The stillness of a man who had heard everything and was already deciding what to do about it. He was 41 floors above the city when his daughter called. The conference room had floor-to-ceiling glass on three sides and 12 people around a table who had spent the last hour discussing a real estate acquisition worth more than most countries' annual budgets. Thomas had been listening with the precise, unhurried attention that had made him one of the most feared men in American finance. He had not checked his phone once. He had not needed to. His daughter knew the difference between a call that could wait and a call that couldn't. When her name appeared on his screen, he answered before the second ring. He stood now with one hand braced against the glass wall, looking out over the city without seeing it, and listened to Lily describe the woman by the fence with the same careful detail she brought to everything. The dark coat, the faded scarf, the pink doll pressed against the woman's chest like something she was keeping alive through sheer force of will. Same place as yesterday, he asked. Almost, a little closer. Is she looking at you now? A pause. He heard Lily lean around something, probably the tree trunk itself, to check. Yes, Thomas straightened. The movement was small. No one in the conference room behind him would have noticed. But Callum Shaw, his head of security, who had been waiting outside the glass doors since the meeting began, saw the change in his employer's posture and was already reaching for his earpiece. Stay behind the tree, Thomas said. Don't walk toward the fence. Don't speak to her. I know, Daddy. He turned from the window. 12 people at the table looked up. He said nothing to any of them. He simply walked out of the room and Callum fell into step beside him before the conference room door had fully closed. We're going to St. Eleanor's, Thomas said. Callum didn't ask why. He had worked for Thomas Caldwell for 12 years, long enough to understand that when the man's voice dropped to that particular register, quiet and absolutely certain questions were not what the moment required. They were in the elevator before Thomas spoke again. She's been standing outside my daughter's school for 3 consecutive mornings. Same woman, same position, same time. Callum processed that with the trained efficiency of a man who had spent his career assessing threats to people who could afford expensive enemies. Do we have a visual? Not yet. I want footage pulled from every camera on that perimeter before I arrive. Already calling it in. The car was waiting at the private garage entrance. Thomas got into the back seat and looked at his phone. Lily's call was still on the screen. He had ended it, gently told her to find her teacher and stay inside, told her she had done exactly the right thing. He had said it calmly, the way he said most things, because Lily needed calm from him, the same way other children needed nightlights. It was the thing that helped her sleep. But in the 30 seconds of silence between the garage entrance and the moment the car pulled into midtown traffic, Thomas Caldwell allowed himself to feel what he had not permitted in his daughter's hearing. Not panic. He was not built for panic. Something colder and more precise than that. The woman had been there 3 days. She had positioned herself within sight of the playground at the exact hour when his daughter went outside. She had not approached the gate. She had not spoken to anyone. She had simply stood there holding an old pink doll and looked at Lily with the kind of attention that belonged only to people who already knew the child they were watching. That detail was the one that cut deepest. Thomas looked out at the city moving past the tinted glass. A delivery truck, a woman with a stroller, a man in a gray coat reading something on his phone while walking fast. The ordinary machinery of a Tuesday morning in Manhattan. None of it could make the thought go away. Whoever this woman was, she had not come to see a school. She had come to see Lily. The drive to St. Eleanor's Academy took 11 minutes. Thomas spent most of them in silence, which Callum understood and respected. 3 years into his employment, Callum had learned that Thomas Caldwell's silences were not absences. They were processing. The man was always working even when he appeared to be doing nothing at all. What Callum did not know, what no one who worked for Thomas knew, was what the man was actually thinking during those 11 minutes in the back of the car. He was remembering a night 6 years earlier, rain against stone. The entrance hall of Caldwell Estate lit by the single lamp Harriet always left on when he came home late. The smell of wet wool and cold air pushing through the front door behind him. And Harriet's face wearing the expression she reserved for things that could not be managed with ordinary household efficiency. "There's a woman here," she had said. "She has a baby." Thomas had assumed a mistake. A charity inquiry routed to the wrong address or someone connected to the Caldwell Foundation's community programs, which his late wife Eleanor had built and which still bore her name. He had assumed confusion. He had not assumed a young woman standing in the small sitting room off the main hall, holding an infant girl against her chest with rain darkening her coat and exhaustion cutting every line of her face into something that looked less like youth and more like the aftermath of it. He had not assumed that. His first instinct, the one that arrived before thought or compassion or any of the things he believed about himself, was to call Harriet back and have someone escort the woman out. The estate was a private residence. He had a security protocol. He had an attorney on call for exactly these situations. His first instinct was to protect what he had built by removing what didn't belong inside it. Harriet had read that instinct on his face the way she read most things about him, accurately and without mercy. "Go look at the child first," she said, "then decide." He had gone, he had looked, and the rest of it was the rest of his life. Thomas closed his eyes for exactly 1 second in the back of the car, then opened them. The school was visible now at the end of the block, the handsome brick facade of St. Eleanor's Academy rising behind its iron fence, and carefully trimmed hedgerows, the kind of institution designed to assure wealthy parents that danger stopped politely at the gate. This morning the assurance felt thin. Two of Callum's vehicles were already at the curb when they arrived. A man in a gray coat stood near the front entrance. Another was positioned at the corner, where the sidewalk turned, eyes moving over the street with the practiced casualness of a professional who needed not to look like one. Thomas stepped out of the car before the driver could open his door. The sidewalk beyond the main gate was empty. He scanned it, taking in the full perimeter, the oak tree at the corner of the playground, the stretch of iron fence running south the bus stop half a block down. No woman in a dark coat, no pink doll. He looked at Callum. "She left approximately 9 minutes before we arrived," Callum said quietly. "But we have something." Inside, St. Eleanor's smelled of old books and lemon polish in the particular orderly calm of an expensive school running its Tuesday morning exactly as it was designed to. The receptionist rose too quickly when Thomas entered. He gave her a single nod and kept moving. Principal Aldgate was waiting near her office with her hands folded at her waist, and the expression of a woman who had spent 30 years managing difficult conversations and now found herself in one she had not anticipated. Beside her stood Mrs. Wren Lilly's homeroom teacher, a younger woman whose composure was clearly costing her considerably more effort than the principal's. Thomas looked past both of them. Lily was in the office. He could see her through the glass panel beside the door, sitting in a high-backed chair with her school bag in her lap and her ankles crossed, because that was how Harriet had taught her to sit when she was uncertain. She was not crying. She was watching the door with the steady, patient attention of a child who had learned that adults arrive faster when you didn't fall apart before they got there. When she saw him, her shoulders came down by half an inch. He crossed the room in 3 strides, opened the office door, and went directly to her. He crouched to her level the way he had since she was old enough to remember. "You all right?" She nodded. "Yes, Daddy." He looked at her face carefully. She was telling the truth. Lily was not a child who performed resilience. When something frightened her, she said so. The fact that she was steady now told him more than any reassurance could have. He touched her arm once briefly, then rose and turned to Aldgate and Miss Wren. "Tell me everything." Ms. Wren answered first. She had noticed the woman on Monday morning and again on Tuesday. She had assumed the woman was a relative waiting for a child. The woman had never approached the gate, never asked anyone for anything, never done anything that Ms. Wren recognized in the moment as requiring a phone call to parents. Thomas listened to all of it without interrupting. When Ms. Wren finished, he said, "You noticed a stranger forming a pattern around my daughter over 2 days and made no call." Ms. Wren lowered her eyes. "I should have. I'm sorry." He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. The quiet was enough. Aldgate stepped in with the stiffened dignity of a woman trying to salvage institutional standing. "The school will review its policy for external observers near the perimeter immediately, Mr. Caldwell. I want you to know that Lily was never in any physical danger." "You want me to know that," Thomas said. He looked at her steadily. "What I want to know is what you've actually done this morning." There was a pause which answered the question more completely than anything Aldgate said afterward. Thomas listened to the procedural response, which involved a groundskeeper and a note to the front desk, and then he stopped listening and looked through the office glass at Lily again. She had taken a small paper cup of apple juice from somewhere and was holding it without drinking it, watching him with that grave, careful attention she brought to most things. He went back into the office. He sat beside her, not across from her. "Show me where she was standing," he said. Lily got up without hesitation and went to the window. She lifted one small hand and pointed across the playground to the stretch of fence near the oak tree. Her finger did not shake. "The same place," she said, "as yesterday and the day before, but today a little closer." Thomas followed the line of her arm. The sidewalk was empty. Spring light fell across the iron bars in ordinary gold stripes. Yet the space felt occupied by something he could not yet name, only recognize. He looked at Lily's profile, the small, serious face, the two braids Harriet had tied with blue ribbon that morning, before breakfast, the way she did every school day, a routine so embedded in the household it had become its own form of love. "I want to ask you something," he said, "and I want you to think carefully before you answer." Lily turned to look at him. She always gave him her full attention. It was one of the things about her that humbled him. "Did she look at you the way a stranger looks at a child?" Lily considered the question in the way she considered everything, turning it over, testing its edges. "No," she said at last. "How then?" Lily looked down at her hands for a moment and then back up. "Like she already knew me. Before I knew her." She paused. "Like it was personal." The last word, spoken in a 6-year-old's matter-of-fact voice, arrived in the room with a weight entirely disproportionate to its size. Thomas did not let his expression change. He had spent decades learning to hold things in his face that he did not want other people to see. But something moved through him at that word, cold, and searching, and old. Something he had kept in a locked part of himself for 6 years and had only now, in a school office with his daughter, looking up at him, begun to feel shifting. "One more thing," he said. "Were you frightened of her?" Lily thought about that for longer than she had thought about any of the other questions. "A little," she said. "At first, not because she looked mean, because she kept coming back." She paused again. "And Daddy, when I looked at her, her eyes were wet. She didn't look like someone who wanted to hurt anybody." Another pause. She looked lonely. Thomas looked at his daughter for a long moment. Then he stood. "We're going home early today," he said. "Harriet is waiting." Lily accepted that without argument, which was its own kind of signal. She slipped from the chair and picked up her school bag. At the door, she paused and looked back through the window at the playground one more time. The oak tree, the fence, the empty sidewalk. "Daddy," she said. "Yes." "You're going back outside, aren't you?" It was not quite a question. "Yes," he said. She nodded once, as though that was the correct answer, and walked out ahead of him. The woman was still on the block. Thomas saw her before Callum did, which was unusual. She had moved from the fence line and was walking south along the sidewalk with the slow, purposeful step of someone who had learned to take up as little space as possible. The dark coat, the faded scarf still tied over her hair, the pink doll now held at her side, pressed against her hip, like something she carried out of habit rather than intention. Thomas said one word to Callum: stay back. He crossed the street alone. She heard him coming, or perhaps she felt a shift in the air, the way people do when someone with authority moves toward them in a public space, because she stopped walking before he reached her. She turned, and for the first time, Thomas Caldwell saw Diana Cole's face clearly, without a camera lens between them, without the softening distance of a grainy monitor. She was younger than he expected, though he did not know exactly what he had expected. 34, he would calculate later from the file. But hardship had given her face the quality of a landscape that had weathered more seasons than its years strictly accounted for. Her cheekbones were sharp, her eyes dark and direct, and filled with something too complicated and too private to name easily. She looked at him without flinching. That surprised him. Most people, when Thomas Caldwell walked toward them with intent, found something important to look at on the sidewalk. Diana Cole looked at him steadily, the way people looked at things they had been rehearsing for a long time. "I know who you are," she said. Her voice was low and careful, stripped of anything that wasn't necessary. "Then you know whose daughter that is," he said. Something crossed her face. Not guilt exactly. Something older and more complicated than guilt. "Yes," she said, "I know." He studied her for a moment. In his professional life, Thomas had learned to read people quickly and accurately. It was one of the skills that had made him formidable. What he read in Diana Cole did not fit any category he had prepared for. There was no aggression in her, no manipulation that he could detect. There was only a terrible, exhausted honesty, and underneath it, something he did not yet have a word for. "Come inside," he said. "There are things that need to be said somewhere that isn't a sidewalk." She did not argue. She did not ask for a lawyer or a moment to think or any of the things people with strategies ask for. She simply tucked the pink ball more firmly under her arm and followed him back toward the school, which told him something. People with plans asked questions before they followed. People who were running out of time followed first. Inside Principal Allgate's office, with Callum positioned near the door, and Allgate herself relegated to a chair she clearly felt she should not be sitting in, Thomas took a place by the window and looked at Diana Cole, who sat with her hands folded in her lap and the pink doll resting against her knee. He had already called Edmund Hale from the sidewalk, 2 quick sentences enough to set things in motion. Edmund's response had been immediate, a recognition rather than a question, and that itself had confirmed what Thomas was already beginning to understand. He looked at the doll. In the 6 years since Lily had come into his house, he had thought of it occasionally the way one thought of all the small details of a significant night. A child who wouldn't sleep without it. A worn pink thing with yarn hair and a cloth dress that had clearly been loved into softness. Harriet had tried to replace it twice with something newer and cleaner, and both times Lily had rejected the replacement so completely that the original was eventually accepted as non-negotiable. The original, which was sitting on Diana Cole's knee in a school principal's office. Thomas's phone buzzed in his pocket. Edmund Hale. He excused himself with a single raised hand and stepped into the hallway. "Edmund, I pulled it." Edmund's voice was the voice of a man in his 60s who had spent 40 years managing other people's legal consequences and had learned to deliver difficult information the way good physicians did directly without theater. "Thomas, before you ask me anything else, I need to tell you something. The private memorandum, the one I said I destroyed. You kept it." "I kept it." Thomas said nothing, waiting. "There's a line in the intake notes that wasn't part of the court record," Edmund said. "I wrote it separately because I didn't think it belonged in official documentation. It was something she said before she handed the child over." Thomas watched through the office glass. Diana Cole had not moved. She was looking at the window, not at Allgate, not at Callum, at the window and whatever she saw beyond it. "Tell me," Thomas said. Edmund was quiet for one beat. She asked, will she know she was wanted? The hallway felt very still. "You answered her," Thomas said. "You weren't in the room at that moment. The child had just been transferred to Harriet's arms. I said I would pass the question along." Edmund paused. I should have ensured that happened. I didn't. I assumed you would address it when the time was right. Thomas looked at Diana Cole through the glass. She had turned now and was looking down at the doll in her lap, one finger tracing something on its worn dress. A stitch. A repair. The mark of a specific kind of care that had nothing to do with money and everything to do with not letting go. 6 years. She had asked one question the night she gave up her daughter, and no one had ever answered it. Will she know she was wanted? Thomas put the phone back in his pocket and stood in the hallway for 11 seconds. He counted them without meaning to. He went back into the office and looked at Diana Cole, who raised her eyes to him with the patient wariness of someone who had been waiting for a verdict for a very long time. The doll, he said, she still has the original. Diana's expression shifted almost imperceptibly. I know. How? Because I brought it to you, and you don't seem like the kind of man who throws things away. There was a silence. It was not an unfriendly silence. It was the silence of two people beginning to take the measure of something that was larger and older than this room. She asked about you, Thomas said. Diana went very still. She said you looked like you already knew her. He paused. She said it felt personal. The woman's hands tightened slightly in her lap. She pressed her lips together. Her eyes filled but didn't overflow, and she held herself with the particular discipline of someone who had taught herself that public grief was a luxury. What do you want? Thomas asked. Not unkindly, but directly, because direct was the only thing that served anyone in a room with this much weight in it. Diana looked at him for a long moment. When she spoke, the words were low and careful, and clearly the truest thing she had said to anyone in a very long time. I heard she was happy. I needed to see it with my own eyes. Thomas waited. Before I disappeared for good, Diana said. The office was quiet. Outside, a class of second graders was crossing the playground in a ragged double line, trading something small between them, whispering. A teacher called out to slow down. The ordinary machinery of a school morning continued its rotation without any awareness of what was happening 20 feet away behind a closed door. Thomas looked at Diana Cole and understood that the adversary he had driven across the city to confront was not an adversary at all. She had not come to claim anything. She had not come armed with a lawyer or a demand or even a hope she had permitted herself to call by that name. She had come to stand outside a fence and confirm with her own eyes that the sacrifice she had made 6 years ago in a rain-soaked entrance hall had been worth the cost. She had come to say goodbye to a child who didn't know she existed. That realization moved through Thomas slowly, the way cold water moved through a house when a pipe broke somewhere deep in the walls. You felt the temperature change before you found the source. He had prepared for a battle. What he was looking at was not a battle. It was a wound that had been walking around for 6 years, wearing a dark coat, carrying an old doll, trying to ask for nothing except a few minutes each morning to watch a little girl run across a playground and be alive. Callum shifted near the door. Aldgate's pen tapped once against her desk pad and then stopped. Thomas clasped his hands and looked at the woman across from him, the woman who had asked a question on the worst night of her life and never received an answer. My car brought Lily home 20 minutes ago, he said. She is safe, she is well. She has been well for 6 years. He paused, and what came next cost him something he didn't have a precise name for. And she was wanted. From the night she arrived in my house, she was wanted. Diana Cole said nothing. She pressed both hands over her mouth and looked at the ceiling for a moment. Her shoulders shook once, just once, and then she pulled herself back. She was, Thomas thought, one of the most disciplined people he had ever seen, which made everything that was coming next harder, not easier. On the drive home with the school growing smaller in the rear window, and the city resuming its oblivious Tuesday afternoon, Lily sat beside Thomas in the back seat with her school bag on her lap and her hands folded on top of it. She had not asked many questions. She had looked at the car, at the security detail at her father's face, and read the situation with the accuracy that had always made talking to her feel like a high-stakes undertaking. After 2 blocks of silence, she spoke. Daddy? Yes. She was quiet for one more moment. When you looked at her, out on the sidewalk. A pause. Did you already know who she was? Thomas looked out the window. The city moved past. A florist unloading tulips from a van. Two boys on bicycles cutting through the crosswalk ahead of the light. A woman sitting on the steps of a brownstone with a coffee cup and a faraway expression. He had told Lily many true things over the course of her 6 years. He had told her that her mother had loved her very much, and that the world was sometimes too hard for love to be enough. He had told her carefully in an age-appropriate language that she had come to him through adoption, that she had begun somewhere before she began with him, and that the before did not diminish the after. He had told her the shape of the truth without all of its contents. The way you could tell a child there was a storm coming without explaining the meteorology. She was asking him now whether the storm had a name he already knew. He owed her the honest answer. He had always known that. He had simply believed there was more time. I had a thought, he said carefully, when you described the doll. Lily was quiet. She was processing. He could feel it the way you could feel weather changing. Is she someone from before? She said. He looked at his daughter, at the braids with the blue ribbon, at the grave-searching face that had been watching the world with that precise attention since before she was old enough to walk, at the child who had called him from behind an oak tree, not out of panic but out of trust. The same trust she was offering him right now in the back of this car at 6 years old, asking him to tell her the true shape of her own life. Yes, he said. Lily nodded slowly. She looked out her own window. After a moment, she said almost to herself, I thought so. They rode the rest of the way in silence. Not an unhappy silence. The silence of two people who had moved through something together and had arrived at a place that would take time to fully understand. When the car turned through the gates of Caldwell Estate and the stone facade of the house came into view, Lily gathered her bag. She looked at her father one more time. Are you going to tell me the rest? She asked. Thomas looked at her steadily. Yes, he said. When I understand the rest myself. She accepted that because it was honest. And because she knew the way she had always known about him, that Thomas Caldwell did not make promises he could not keep. The house was warm and quiet. Harriet was in the entrance hall, which was where she always was when something mattered. And she looked first at Lily and then at Thomas with the eyes of a woman who had read this household's weather for long enough to know that something had shifted in the atmosphere. She said nothing. She simply took Lily's school bag with one hand and put the other on the child's shoulder and said, soup first. Then you can tell me whatever you'd like. Lily went with her. Thomas stood alone in the entrance hall of his house. Around him, the walls held paintings and photographs in the accumulated weight of a life built carefully on specific foundations. Through the doorway to the left was his study. Through the passage ahead was the kitchen, warm with whatever Harriet had already started on the stove. Above him, the staircase led to Lily's room, where a worn pink doll sat in a place of honor on the shelf beside her books. The same doll that Diana Cole had carried through the door of this house 6 years ago. The same doll Diana Cole had been holding outside the fence. Thomas stood still for a moment, listening to the sound of Harriet's voice and Lily's quieter responses drifting from the kitchen, and then he walked to his study and closed the door softly behind him. He sat at his desk. He opened Edmund's email. He read the memorandum, all of it, not the way a man reviewed a contract, but the way a man read something that had always been true, and that he had simply, for reasons he could no longer fully defend, chosen to leave folded in a drawer. Diana Reeves, the file read, 28 years of age at time of transfer, no fixed residence, history of temporary shelter placement, one documented domestic violence incident report closed at subject's request, no immediate family available or willing to assist, child approximately 12 months of age presented in fair condition, underweight but alert. Mother presented coherent, exhausted, not intoxicated. And then at the bottom of Edmund's private addendum, in the man's precise handwriting that had been scanned into a PDF and never filed anywhere official, before releasing custody of the child subject, asked one question, quote, will she know she was wanted, end quote. Response was deferred pending availability of adoptive party. Thomas sat with that sentence for a long time. Outside his window, the afternoon light moved slowly across the western lawn. Somewhere beyond the tree line, a bird was working through something complicated and repetitive, the same four notes in different arrangements. He had built this life on the principle that the right decisions made clearly and executed completely produced outcomes that justified themselves. He had applied that principle to finance, to governance, to loss, to fatherhood. He had applied it to the night 6 years ago when a woman had stood in his entrance hall in a wet coat and asked him to give her daughter a future she herself could not provide. He had made the right decision. He had also left a question unanswered for 6 years, and the woman who had asked it had come back carrying a faded pink doll and her own unanswered grief standing outside a school fence in the cold, watching from a distance because she had never been given any closer place to stand. Thomas closed the file and looked out the window. Through the study door, he could hear Lily's voice clearer now, asking Harriet something about the soup. He heard Harriet's response, low and warm and unhurried. He heard Lily laugh briefly at something. The laugh was small and light and entirely itself. He had kept her safe. He had kept his promise. But there was another promise he had not known he was making and had not kept, and it had found its way back to him anyway, the way unpaid debts always did, quietly on an ordinary Tuesday morning, standing by an iron fence with a pink doll in its arms. He picked up his phone and called Edmund Hale. "I need to know everything," he said. "Everything you held back. Everything you thought could wait." Edmund was quiet for a moment. "Then I'll send the full file tonight." "Send it now." A pause. "Thomas, if you're asking what I think you're asking, then you already know where this is going." Thomas looked at the photograph on his desk. Lily at 4 years old on a beach in Maine, laughing at something just outside the frame, her braids blowing sideways in the wind, her hand wrapped around his thumb, with the absolute confidence of a child who had never once questioned whether she was held. "I know where it's going," he said. "I want to know how to get there without breaking anything that doesn't need to be broken." Edmund exhaled slowly. "Then give me an hour." Thomas set the phone down. He leaned back in his chair. The afternoon light continued its slow migration across the lawn. In the kitchen at the far end of the house, his daughter was telling Harriet about the fox in the story they'd been reading in class, and why she thought the fox had made the wrong choice in chapter 3 and what she would have done differently. Thomas listened until he could not hear the words anymore, only the sound of her voice, steady and particular and entirely irreducibly hers. He sat with that for a long time. Then he picked up the phone again, because there were things that needed to be done before tomorrow arrived, and Thomas Caldwell had never been a man who let tomorrow do the work that today required of him. The morning after was quieter than it had any right to be. Caldwell Estate ran on routine the way fine machinery ran on oil. Breakfast at 7:30, the financial news low on the kitchen television, the gardener's truck along the rear drive at 8, Harriet moving between stove and counter with the unhurried precision of someone who had decided long ago that order was its own form of love. Lily came downstairs at 7:22 in her pale yellow dress with the small white buttons, which was not a school dress. Thomas had told her the night before briefly, and without elaboration, that she would not be going to St. Eleanor's today. She had not argued. She had simply nodded in the way she nodded when she was thinking about something too large to respond to right away. And she had gone to bed carrying the pink doll under her arm. She brought it to breakfast. Not tucked under her arm this time. She set it on the stool beside her at the kitchen island, deliberately the way you place something important, somewhere you could keep an eye on it. Harriet saw this and said nothing. She set a plate of buttered toast in front of Lily and poured the orange juice and went back to the stove. Thomas was already at the table. Black coffee. The Wall Street Journal folded beside his plate in a way that made it clear he had not yet opened it. He was watching his daughter with the careful, unhurried attention he usually reserved for balance sheets and board presentations, looking for what the numbers weren't saying. Lily stirred her oatmeal. The brown sugar had long dissolved. She stirred it anyway. "Is she going to come back?" she said. She did not specify who. She did not need to. Thomas set down his coffee cup. That's what I'm working to understand. Lily looked at the doll beside her, then at him. Did you talk to her inside the school? Briefly. What did she say? Thomas considered the question. In his experience, the most dangerous thing a parent could do was simplify the truth so much that the child eventually discovered the simplification and lost faith in the simplifier. He had tried across 6 years of raising Lily to give her honest answers, scaled to what she could carry. The difficulty was that Lily could carry more than most adults gave her credit for, and she always knew when she was being given less than the real thing. She said she needed to see that you were all right, he said. Lily absorbed that. Was she making sure, or was she saying goodbye? The precision of the question hit him somewhere behind the sternum. He looked at his daughter, who was looking back at him with those dark, steady eyes that had always seemed to contain more floors than a 6-year-old should reasonably have access to. I think he said carefully, it may have been both. Lily looked back at her oatmeal. She took a small bite, chewed, swallowed, set the spoon down. That's sad, she said. Harriet at the counter had gone very still in the way she went still when she was listening to something she needed to hear all of. Thomas said, yes, it is. Lily picked up her toast. She tore a corner off with the particular seriousness she brought to food when she was working through something in her mind. Is she poor? Thomas paused. Yes. Like really poor, or just not as much as us poor. Harriet made a sound that was not quite a cough. Really poor, Thomas said. Lily thought about that. She turned the piece of toast over in her fingers. That's why she couldn't keep me, isn't it? It wasn't because she didn't want to. The kitchen was very quiet. Thomas had prepared over the years various versions of this conversation. He had consulted child psychologists. He had read 3 books Edmund had quietly recommended, and 2 more he had found himself. He had assembled a set of honest, age-appropriate answers for the questions he anticipated Lily would eventually ask about her origins. None of the books had prepared him for a 6-year-old who arrived at the conclusion before he finished the sentence. That's part of it, he said. Yes. Lily set the toast down. She looked at the doll. Something moved across her face, not grief exactly, more the expression of a person who had just found the missing piece of a puzzle they had been working on without quite knowing it. She kept the doll, Lily said quietly, because she didn't have anything else of mine. Harriet turned fully away from the counter. She pressed one hand briefly to the edge of the sink, steadying herself, and then resumed what she had been doing with the careful efficiency of someone who understood that falling apart in a kitchen was not among her job responsibilities, no matter how much the moment warranted it. Thomas said nothing, because Lily was right and she had found it herself, and some truths were better received than delivered. After a moment, Lily picked up her spoon again. She ate 3 more bites of oatmeal with the composed, methodical focus of a child who had decided to be practical about something large, because the alternative was being overwhelmed by it. Then she said, "Can I ask Harriet something?" "Of course," Thomas said. Lily looked at Harriet's back. "Did you know about who she was?" Harriet turned around. She looked at Lily without the softening, diplomatic distance most adults put between themselves and uncomfortable questions from children. "I knew someone had come to the house 6 years ago," Harriet said. "I was there that night." Lily's eyes widened very slightly. "You saw her?" "I did." "What did you think?" Harriet came to the island and stood on the other side of it, close enough to make the conversation feel like a real one. "I thought she was one of the bravest and most heartbroken people I had ever seen in my life." Lily looked down at the doll. "Brave how?" "Because she came here not to ask for something for herself," Harriet said. "She came to ask for something for you. Those are not the same kind of brave." Lily was quiet for a long time after that. Long enough that Thomas finished his coffee and Harriet began clearing plates, and the morning shifted from its early gold into the clearer, less forgiving light of mid-morning. Then Lily said without looking up, "Is she my first mother?" The question landed in the kitchen the way large questions did when children finally said them aloud. Not with drama, with weight. Harriet looked at Thomas. Thomas looked at Lily. Yes, he said, she is. Lily nodded slowly. Her hand moved to the doll beside her and rested there, not clutching it, just touching it, the way you touch something when you needed to know it was still real. Okay, she said, just that okay, with the solemnity of a child who was not dismissing the information, but filing it carefully in a place deep enough to keep it safe until she knew what to do with it. Thomas watched her and felt something that had no clean name. Not grief, not relief. Something in between, like the moment a wound stopped bleeding and you understood for the first time how deep it had actually gone. He excused himself from the table and went to his study. Edmund Hale's full file had arrived the previous evening as promised, and Thomas had read it twice before midnight and once more in the gray hour before dawn. He knew its contents with the thoroughness he brought to any document that had the power to alter the structural foundations of something he cared about. What he was still working through was not the information. It was what the information meant about choices he had made and choices he had failed to make, and the distance between those two things. He sat at his desk and opened the file again. Diana Cole, 34 years old, the age she was now because the file had been written 6 years ago when she was 28, and time had not stopped moving, simply because the legal arrangement had been finalized. She had lived 34 years of a life that the sealed adoption file described in the way legal documents always describe difficult lives, in the flat, practical language of fact, stripped of everything that made facts feel like human experiences. Temporary shelter placement, documented domestic incident, no fixed income, no family support network. What the file did not say, and what Thomas now found himself needing to understand, was what 34 years of that kind of life produced in a person, what it cost, what it left behind. He thought about her face on the sidewalk, the way she had looked at him without flinching, the way she had answered his questions with the economical honesty of someone who had long ago run out of the energy required to manage other people's impressions of her. He thought about what she had said. I needed to see it with my own eyes before I disappeared for good. He had been wrong about her. Not about her in the way a man was wrong about a stranger he had misjudged on a first impression. Wrong in a more consequential way. He had spent the 11 minutes in the car yesterday preparing to contain a threat, and what he had found on the sidewalk was not a threat. It was a person at the end of a very long road, asking for nothing, expecting nothing, carrying one old pink doll, in 6 years of a silence she had kept because she believed it was the most honest form of love left available to her. Thomas closed the file and called Edmund. The incident 3 years ago, he said when Edmund answered. The contact attempt. Edmund was quiet for a moment. You read that section. Tell me exactly what happened. Another pause longer this time. Edmund Hale had been Thomas's attorney for 22 years. He was a careful, principled man who had navigated the legal complexities of significant wealth with the integrity of someone who understood that the law existed to serve people, not the other way around. He was also a man who had made, in this instance, a decision he could not entirely defend, and he knew it. 3 years ago, Edmund said, a woman called the Caldwell Group's main office line. She identified herself by name. She said she was not calling to make any legal claim. She said she understood the terms of the arrangement completely. She asked only whether it would be possible to send a gift anonymously to a child whose birthday she believed was coming up. Thomas said nothing. The intake coordinator who took the call followed protocol, Edmund continued. Any contact from individuals connected to prior adoption proceedings was to be flagged and referred to legal. The coordinator flagged it. Someone in my office reviewed it. He paused and marked it closed without escalating to me. Without escalating to you, T.E., Thomas repeated. I found it 6 months later during a file audit. By then the birthday had passed. And you didn't tell me. Edmund was quiet. Edmund, I told myself it was better managed quietly, Edmund said. That surfacing it would create complications that weren't in Lily's best interest. That the arrangement was clean was safer. A pause. I was wrong. I should have brought it to you immediately and let you decide. Thomas sat with the phone against his ear and looked at the window. The western lawn was bright in the mid-morning light. A groundskeeper was moving along the far tree line, unhurried, working the edge of the property with the patient steadiness of someone who understood that the work was never truly finished, only managed. She tried to give my daughter a birthday present, Thomas said, and the system I built to protect Lily turned it away without telling me. Edmund said nothing because there was nothing to say to that which was not simply true. Thomas ended the call. He remained at his desk for several minutes without moving. There was a particular kind of reckoning that arrived not in a single moment of revelation, but in accumulation. One detail added to another until the full shape of something became visible. The shape of what you had done and what you had not done and what those two things together had produced in the world. He had built a clean life for his daughter. He had done it with care and intelligence and genuine love. He had made the adoption legal and permanent and airtight in every way the law permitted. He had given Lily Caldwell a state and St. Eleanor's Academy and Harriet's soup and blue ribbons in her hair and a father who came when she called. He had given her every material and emotional advantage available to a man of his resources and intention. And the woman who had made all of that possible by giving up the thing she loved most had been standing outside a school fence in a worn coat for 3 mornings because no one had ever given her anywhere closer to stand. Thomas stood up from his desk. He walked to the kitchen where Harriet was washing the breakfast dishes with the radio on low, and Lily had moved from the kitchen island to the window seat in the adjoining breakfast room, sitting with the doll in her lap and looking out at the rear garden with the particular private attention of a child who was conducting important internal business. He stood in the doorway for a moment watching his daughter. She had her mother's eyes. Not Eleanor's, who had died before she could see the child Thomas eventually brought home. Not any eyes he recognized from his own history. She had eyes that were entirely her own, which meant they were someone else's before they were hers, and that someone else was sitting in a room somewhere in Midtown East that was smaller than this hallway. Harriet turned from the sink and saw his expression. She dried her hands without hurrying. "She's been thinking since breakfast," she said quietly. "I know. She hasn't asked me anything else. She's waiting for you." Thomas walked into the breakfast room. Lily looked up from the window when she heard his footsteps. She didn't say anything. She just watched him cross the room and sit down in the armchair near the window seat, close enough to talk, far enough to give her space. He looked at her. She looked at him. "You have questions," he said. "Yes." "Ask them." Lily looked down at the doll for a moment and then back up. "Did she want to keep me?" Thomas did not allow himself to pause, because this was the question, the one that everything else was arranged around, and Lily had asked it with a directness that required the same in return. "Yes," he said, "she wanted to keep you very much." Lily's hands tightened almost imperceptibly around the doll. "Then why didn't she?" "Because wanting and being able to are not always the same thing." He leaned forward slightly, his voice dropping into the register he used when he needed her to hear every word. She was living in a situation that was dangerous. The man she had been with was someone who hurt people. She had very little money, no safe place to stay, no family who could help. She looked at you, and she looked at that situation, and she made the hardest decision a person can make. Lily listened with her whole face the way she always listened when something mattered. "She chose what was better for you," Thomas said, "over what she wanted for herself." The breakfast room was very quiet. Outside the window, a robin landed on the garden wall, looked around with the sharp alertness of small birds, and flew off again. "Did it hurt her?" Lily asked. "Yes," Thomas said. "I believe it hurt her very much, and I believe it has hurt her every day since." Lily looked at the doll. She ran one thumb along its dress over the places where it had been mended and remended across years of small repairs. "She kept fixing the doll," she said softly, "even after I was gone." Thomas said nothing. He let that sit where she had put it because she had put it exactly right. After a moment, Lily looked up. "Is she going to disappear again?" The question was simple and devastating in equal measure. Thomas had been thinking about this since the sidewalk, since the office, since the drive home in the evening in his study, in the 3 reads of Edmund's file, in the phone call this morning. He had been turning it over with the same rigor he brought to any question with significant consequences, looking at it from every angle, testing it for weaknesses. And what he had found was that the question was no longer only his to answer. I don't know yet, he said. That depends on choices that more than one person needs to make. Lily considered that. Do I get to be one of the people? Thomas looked at his daughter, 6 years old, sitting in a window seat in a house built on the decision of a woman she had never met, holding the only object that connected her present life to her first one. Yes, he said, you are the most important one. Something settled in Lily's face. Not resolution, not peace exactly, but the particular quality of a child who has been told the truth about her own significance and has accepted it without theatrics. She looked out the window for a moment. Then she said, I want to meet her, properly, not through offense. Thomas had expected the question eventually. He had not expected it before lunch on the day after. He nodded once. I know. Can you make that happen? Yes, he said. I can make that happen. Lily looked at him with that steady, searching gaze. Are you going to, or are you going to wait? Thomas almost smiled. It arrived and departed in less than a second, not quite reaching the surface. I'm going to, he said. That satisfied her. She looked back at the doll. Good, she said simply in the tone she used when she had made a decision and considered the matter settled. She was quiet then. Thomas remained in the armchair. Outside the garden held its spring green in its ordinary Wednesday morning light and the sound of a lawn somewhere being attended to. The household resumed its modest functions around them. Somewhere deeper in the house, the grandfather clock marked the quarter hour. Thomas looked at his daughter and understood that the conversation he had been dreading for 6 years was not the one that had just happened. That conversation had been taken care of by a 6-year-old with a worn pink doll and a direct manner of asking questions. The conversation he actually needed to have was a different one, harder in a different way, requiring a different kind of courage. He needed to call Diana Cole. He went back to his study after leaving Lily with Harriet, who had a gift for knowing exactly when to reappear with something practical. He sat at his desk and found the number Edmund had included in the file addendum, a cell phone number obtained through the shelter intake records. He stared at it for a moment. In his professional life, Thomas Caldwell initiated conversations from positions of strength. He structured exchanges to produce the outcomes he had already identified and decided were acceptable. He walked into rooms knowing what he needed and having a clear sense of how to get it. He was about to call a woman he had met once briefly 24 hours ago on a sidewalk, who had given him his daughter 6 years before that, and he had no clear idea what the outcome of the conversation should look like. He only knew it needed to happen, and that Lily had told him not to wait, and that he had promised he wouldn't. He dialed. She answered on the third ring. Mr. Caldwell. No surprise in her voice. Either she had saved his number, which meant Edmund had given it to her, or she had simply been expecting the call. Diana, he said. Silence for a moment. The use of her first name had shifted something, not dramatically, subtly, like the small change in pressure before weather arrived. Lily wants to meet you, he said, properly, not at school, not through anyone else. Diana was quiet for long enough that Thomas could hear the ambient sounds around her, thin walls, traffic, the low talk of a television somewhere in the building. Why are you telling me this today? She said. Because she asked me to make it happen, and I told her I would. Just like that. Not just like that, Thomas said. She asked me this morning after breakfast, after she had thought about it carefully, and what she asked was direct and considered. She is 6 years old, and she asked better questions this morning than most adults ask in a lifetime, and she deserves a direct answer. He paused. So do you. Another silence. This one softer. I didn't come back to cause trouble, Diana said. Her voice was low and careful the way it had been on the sidewalk, like something she was moving through very slowly because she couldn't afford to break it. I want you to know that. I came because I got to a point where not knowing was worse than knowing, and I needed to see her once, just once. I understand that now, Thomas said, a pause. You do. I didn't yesterday. Not fully. He looked at the file on his desk at the last line of Edmund's private addendum. There are things I've learned in the last 24 hours that I should have known sooner. Things my office should have brought to me and didn't. Things I should have thought to ask about and didn't. He stopped. He was not a man who made speeches. He was not a man who offered vulnerability easily or often. I'm not going to apologize in a way that makes me feel better without changing anything. What I am going to do is make sure the next part goes differently. Diana said nothing for a moment. He could hear her breathing. She really asked, Diana said at last. Quietly, almost too quietly. This morning, her exact words were, I want to meet her properly, not through offense. Something happened on the other end of the line. Not a sound exactly, more an absence of sound, the specific quiet of a person receiving something they had stopped believing would arrive. When Diana spoke again, her voice had shifted, still careful, still low, but something in it had opened the way a room changed when a window was finally raised. Okay, she said. There will be ground rules, Thomas said. Not because I distrust you, because Lily's stability comes first. Always. Yes, Diana said. It should. The meeting will be in a place I choose. Neutral. Not this house and not where you're staying. Somewhere that doesn't belong to either of us. Okay. I will be there. Harriet will be there. Edmund Hale may be present. Okay. And Diana? Yes. Thomas looked at the photograph on his desk. Lily at 4 on the main beach, laughing at something outside the frame, her hand wrapped around his thumb. If this is going to be anything more than a single meeting, he said, then it has to be built on a foundation that can hold the weight of it. That means honesty about what each of us can offer and what we can't. No promises that can't be kept. No expectations that haven't been stated. Mr. Caldwell, Diana said. Thomas. A pause. Thomas. She said the name with the careful deliberateness of someone handling something unfamiliar but not unwilling. I have been very careful for 6 years not to want more than I had a right to. I am not going to walk into your daughter's life and ask for things I haven't earned. Another pause. But I am not going to walk out of it again either. Not if she doesn't want me to. Thomas sat with that. He recognized the truest thing either of them had said in the conversation, and it had come from her. I'll have Edmund send you the details for the meeting, he said, 2 days from now, if that works for you. It works, Diana said. He ended the call and set the phone on the desk. He sat in the quiet of his study with the afternoon light beginning to move toward the windows from the west, and the sound of Lily somewhere in the house talking to Harriet about something, her voice indistinct, but her cadence recognizable, that particular rhythm of a child working through something large by talking around it to someone safe. He had done what she asked. He had not waited. He looked at his desk, at the file, at the photograph, at the folded newspaper he still hadn't opened, at the fountain pen resting in its holder the way it did every day, entirely unaware that today was not the same kind of day as yesterday. Through the study window, the estate's western lawn stretched toward the old maples at the property line. The light on the grass was the particular gold of late afternoon and early spring, the kind that made things look almost unreasonably beautiful, the kind that made it briefly possible to believe that what had been broken could be something other than permanently broken. Thomas Caldwell sat in his study and allowed himself for the first time in 6 years to consider what that might look like. Not fixed, he was too honest for that word, but different than before, better in some specific, hard-won, carefully managed way that would require constant attention and carry no guarantees. He thought about Lily's hand on the doll that morning, the way she had touched it, not like a toy, but like evidence. He thought about Diana's voice on the phone just now, the way she had said it works without a single additional condition. He thought about Harriet saying 6 years ago in a rain-soaked entrance hall, go look at the child first. then decide. He had looked. He had decided. Now he was looking again. And what he saw this time was not a child who needed to be protected from her own history, but a 6-year-old girl who had already found the most important pieces of that history herself on a Tuesday morning behind an oak tree before any of the adults in her life had decided she was ready for them. He stood, straightened his jacket, and went to find his daughter. She was in the kitchen with Harriet, sitting on the high stool at the island, the doll prop beside her, telling Harriet her theory about why the fox in her classroom story had made the wrong choice in Chapter 3. Harriet was listening with the full, genuine attention she brought to everything Lily said, nodding in the places that required nodding, asking the questions that opened the argument wider. Lily looked up when Thomas came in. "Did you call her?" she asked. "Yes." "Is she coming? 2 days from now?" Lily nodded once with the gravity of a small person who has delegated an important task to a trusted subordinate and received a satisfactory report. "Good," she said. Then she turned back to Harriet and resumed her argument about the fox. Thomas stood in the doorway of his kitchen and watched his daughter think and eat and talk and hold the old pink doll close to her side without seeming to realize she was doing it. Outside, the afternoon light continued its slow work across the lawn. Inside, the house held everything it had always held, and one thing more, not yet arrived, not yet named, but no longer sealed away in a drawer, where the wrong person had placed it and the right person had never thought to look. 2 days passed, the way days passed, in a house where something large was being quietly prepared for. The routines held. Harriet made breakfast at 7:30 and dinner at 6 and moved through the estate's rooms with her usual unhurried authority. Callum Shaw ran his security rotations without visible adjustment. The gardener came on Thursday morning. The mail arrived. The coffee was made and drunk and made again. But everything carried a different weight. The way furniture in a room felt heavier the morning before guests arrived. Not unpleasant, simply loaded with the awareness that the ordinary configuration of things was about to be rearranged, and that once rearranged, it would not go back to exactly what it had been before. Lily understood this without being told. She was a child who read atmospheres the way trained navigators read weather quietly, accurately, without making a show of it. She went about her 2 days with a composed intentionality of someone who had decided to be ready. She ate her meals. She did the spelling words Harriet set out for her each morning. She read her chapter book. She watched the rear garden from the breakfast room window for long stretches without saying what she was thinking about, which meant she was thinking about something significant. She kept the pink doll close, on the kitchen stool beside her at meals, on the cushion next to her on the window seat, on the pillow beside her on at night, which Harriet reported to Thomas in the quiet of the hallway outside Lily's room on Thursday evening, with an expression that required no elaboration. Thomas himself spent the 2 days managing what could be managed and sitting with what could not. Edmund Hale sent Diana Cole the address and the time, and a brief, formal note that Thomas had reviewed and approved. Edmund had written it with the careful neutrality of a man who understood that this was not a legal proceeding and that the language of legal proceedings would be exactly wrong for what it needed to accomplish. Diana responded with 2 words, "I'll be there." Thomas had the Riverside townhouse prepared on Thursday. It was a modest property by Caldwell standards, a 4-story brick building on a quiet street in the West Village that he had purchased years ago for its usefulness as a discreet meeting place, the kind of space that conveyed seriousness without conveying power, which was precisely the quality the afternoon required. The garden room on the ground floor opened through French doors onto a small brick courtyard, where climbing roses had been trained along the low stone walls over many years, and now bloomed in the particular soft chaos of things that had been tended long enough to develop opinions about their own direction. Harriet arrived at the townhouse 2 hours early. She put tulips on the windowsill and set a tray with lemonade for Lily and tea for the adults, and a plate of shortbread that she acknowledged to herself no one would likely touch. She opened the garden room curtains to let in the spring light and moved the straight-back chair 3 inches to the left, because at its original angle it felt like a witness stand, and this afternoon required something less adversarial than that. When she was satisfied, she called Thomas. "It's ready," she said. "Bring her." They arrived at 1:15, Thomas and Lily in the back of the car, Callum in the front. Lily wore the yellow dress with the small white buttons, which she had chosen herself that morning without consultation. She had the pink doll in her lap. She had been quiet for most of the drive, in the way she was quiet when she was not empty of thought, but too full of it to sort into language. At the corner before the townhouse, she spoke. "Daddy?" "Yes." "If she cries again, is that okay?" Thomas looked at his daughter. "Yes, that's okay." "Will you be right there?" "Right there," he said. Lily nodded. She looked back out the window. "Okay," she said quietly, to herself more than to him. Harriet was at the door when they arrived. She took one look at Lily and said nothing beyond a brief warm hand on the child's shoulder, because Harriet had a gift for knowing when children needed words and when they needed only the steady weight of a trusted presence. The garden room was everything Thomas had hoped. Light, quiet, neither grand nor bare. The tulips on the windowsill caught the afternoon sun. The courtyard beyond the French doors held its climbing roses and its particular privacy, the sense of a space that had been designed to let difficult conversations happen without the pressure of the outside world pressing in through the walls. Lily walked into the room and stopped in the middle of it. She looked at the chairs, at the tulips, at the French doors, and the courtyard beyond. She took it in with the full attention she gave to new environments, mapping it, understanding it, deciding how she felt about it. "It's nice," she said. "Good," Thomas said. They sat. Lily took the small settee near the window of the doll beside her. Thomas took the armchair, positioned at an angle that allowed him to see both his daughter and the room's entrance. Harriet remained near the interior door, calm and present, and precisely as visible as the situation required. At 1:31, Callum appeared at the doorway. Diana Cole was here. Thomas stood. Lily did not. She sat very still on the settee with her hands folded in her lap and looked at the door with the expression of a person who has been preparing for something and is now on the other side of the preparation in the moment itself, which always feels different than the practice. Diana came in. She was wearing a clean navy sweater and dark trousers. Her hair was pulled back neatly. The worn coat and the faded scarf were absent, and without them, she looked younger and more exposed in a way that was not weakness, but honesty, the appearance of a person who had chosen not to armor themselves for this particular encounter. She did not have the pink doll. She stopped just inside the threshold. Her eyes went to Lily immediately, and then they stayed there, and something in her face opened so completely and so privately that Thomas looked briefly away, because what he saw in it did not belong to him. The room held its breath. Edmund Hale, who had entered behind Diana and taken a discreet position near the bookcase, looked at his folded hands. Harriet looked at Lily. Lily looked at Diana. Neither of them spoke for a moment that stretched itself out well past ordinary duration and into the territory of things that could not be rushed without being ruined. Then Lily said, "Your voice sounds different today." Diana blinked. "Different how?" "Less broken," Lily said. The simplicity of it rearranged something in the room. Edmund looked up. Harriet's expression shifted almost imperceptibly towards something that might, in a different context, have been a smile. Diana let out a breath that she had probably been holding since the car. "That's probably true," she said softly. Lily studied her with the serious, unhurried attention she applied to things she was trying to understand from the inside out. "I wanted to hear what you sounded like," she said, "when you weren't sad." Diana said, "I'm glad you wanted to know." A pause. Then Lily looked down at the doll beside her on the settee. She picked it up, held it for a moment, turned it slightly in her hands. "Did you fix the hem?" she asked. Diana took one careful step farther into the room. "Yes, it tore when you were little. You used to drag her by one leg across the floor." Lily considered this with the gravity it apparently deserved. "That sounds rude." Diana made a sound that surprised everyone, including herself. It was a laugh, brief and quiet and entirely genuine, arriving before she could decide whether to let it or not. Lily looked up at her with something shifting in her face. Not a smile exactly. the beginning of the possibility of one. Thomas let out a breath he had not been aware of holding. The room changed with that small sound, that single involuntary laugh. The way a room changed when someone finally opened a window that had been painted shut for too long. Not transformed, not fixed, simply different in temperature, more breathable. Diana moved to the straight-back chair and sat, not because anyone had invited her to, but because her legs had apparently registered the shift before the rest of her caught up. She perched on the edge of it with the instinctive carefulness of someone who was not yet sure they had the right to take up full space. Lily looked at her for another long moment. Then she said, "If you love me, why did you leave me?" The question arrived without cruelty, without accusation. In the same, even direct tone Lily used for every question she considered important enough to ask out loud, which made it, if anything, harder to receive because there was nowhere to deflect it and nothing to push back against. It simply sat in the room and waited to be answered. Diana closed her eyes for one breath, just one. When she opened them, they were full, but she held herself in place, and what followed was not a speech or an apology or a carefully constructed narrative. It was the truth told the way people told things when they had finally stopped having the energy to manage how the truth made them look. "I didn't leave because I stopped loving you," she said. Her voice was low and steady, held there by effort rather than ease. "I left because the life around me was dangerous and I was afraid it was going to swallow you too." Lily listened. Her hands rested in her lap, one of them touching the doll without clutching it. Diana continued, "I was living in one room over a laundromat. Before that, it was shelters and friends' floors and places that wanted money by the second week that I didn't have. The man I had been with was someone who hurt people without needing a reason. I used to sit awake at night holding you because I was afraid if I slept too hard, I wouldn't hear trouble before it reached us." The room was absolutely still. "I walked to church offices and shelter desks and social workers' appointments until my feet bled through my shoes," Diana said, "because I thought if I kept asking, someone would look at you and decide you were worth saving. But there was no one left to ask. And then I heard a name." Her eyes moved briefly to Thomas and then back to Lily. "Someone said there was a man who had paid for a child's surgery and never put his name in the paper. Someone else said his family had built shelters years ago. I didn't come to him with hope. I came because I had reached the place where love and terror felt the same, and I needed a door." Thomas looked at the window. At the courtyard beyond it, the climbing roses in their mild and patient bloom. Diana's voice dropped. "I brought you to him because if I kept you with me, I thought I might lose you to hunger or violence or one bad night that never ended. And if I gave you up, I thought maybe you would grow up hating me." She paused. "But alive seemed like the better choice. Alive and safe and given things I could not give you. That felt like the only honest form of love I had left." Lily sat very still. The afternoon light lay across the settee in warm, unhurried bars. "Did you want to keep me?" she asked. Diana's composure shook for the first time. Not collapsed. Shook the way a structure shook in wind, bearing the force without yielding, but bearing it visibly. "Every second," she said. "Every single second. I wanted to run back out into the rain with you in my arms and tell him I had changed my mind and take you somewhere far away and pretend that love would become a roof if I believed in it hard enough." A tear tracked down her face. She didn't move to stop it. But wanting is not the same as being able to. That was the cruelest thing I ever learned. Lily's eyes filled. She did not cry. She held very still the way she held still with large things, letting them settle into her rather than pushing against them. After a long moment, she said, "Were you lonely without me?" Diana's mouth curved in the broken, helpless way of someone who has been asked the one question that makes all the managed composure irrelevant. "Yes," she said, "all the time. Even when you were busy, especially then." Lily looked down at the doll in her lap. She was quiet for a while, her thumb moving along the mended hem of the doll's dress over the careful, mismatched stitching of all those small repairs across all those years. Then she stood up. Everyone in the room registered the movement. Thomas straightened slightly in the armchair. Edmund looked up from his hands. Harriet went very still near the door. Diana did not move. She sat in a straight-back chair and watched Lily cross the few feet of space between them with the slow, deliberate seriousness of a child who understood the weight of what she was doing. Lily stopped in front of her. She held out the pink doll. "I think you should hold her for a minute too," she said. Diana stared at the doll. Her hands came up trembling, and she took it with both of them the way you took something fragile that you had not expected to be allowed to touch again. Her fingers shook badly enough that she nearly dropped it, and she caught it and pressed it against her chest and closed her eyes. Harriet turned to the window. Edmund put one hand briefly over his mouth. Thomas lowered his head, one hand pressed to his jaw, looking at nothing. Because this was not his moment to witness directly, it belonged entirely to the two of them. And the only honest thing he could do was hold its edges without making it about himself. Lily placed one small hand lightly on the doll's worn dress where Diana held it. For a moment, both of them were holding the same thing. The same object that had traveled from a rainy entrance hall 6 years ago through a childhood and across a school fence and into the sun-filled room, carrying everything that words had not been permitted to carry and silence had not been able to hold. Then Lily turned and reached back without looking and found Thomas's hand. He rose from the armchair immediately and came to her, standing just behind and beside her, close enough that she could lean if she needed to. Her fingers wrapped around his with the uncomplicated certainty of a child who knew exactly where home was, even in the middle of territory she had never navigated before. She stood between them, one hand holding her father, one hand resting on the doll that her first mother was holding against her chest. She looked up at Diana. Her voice when it came was small and clear and entirely without performance. "Can someone be your mother," she said, "and still not be the one who raised you?" Diana's face crumpled. She pressed her lips together and looked at the ceiling and then back at Lily, and what was in her eyes was not grief anymore, or not only grief, it was something that had survived grief and come out the other side into a place that didn't have a clean name, but felt in this specific light, in this specific room, something close to grace. "Yes," Diana whispered. "Yes, sweetheart." Lily nodded slowly, as though this was the answer she had suspected all along and simply needed confirmed by someone with the authority to confirm it. She squeezed Thomas's hand once, then released it. She took the doll gently back from Diana's arms, and Diana let it go with the practiced, devastating ease of a woman who had spent 6 years learning how to release what she loved. Lily returned to the settee and sat down. She placed the doll in her lap and looked at both of them, Thomas standing where she had left him, and Dinah still in the straight-back chair. And then she looked at the tulips on the windowsill for a moment, with the expression of someone who has arrived at the end of a long piece of mental work and is resting before beginning the next one. "Okay," she said, just that. "Okay," in the tone that meant she had decided something and the deciding was done. Edmund cleared his throat gently. Harriet moved from the doorway to the tray and began with quiet efficiency to pour tea that no one had asked for because some moments required the architecture of ordinary action to prevent them from collapsing under their own weight. Thomas looked at Diana. She was looking at Lily with the expression he imagined she had worn outside the school fence, that raw, private intensity that had unnerved his daughter through iron bars, and now in this room and in this light, read entirely differently. It was not fixation. It was not desperation. It was the look of someone who had been permitted after a very long time to look. "Diana," Thomas said. She looked at him. He had thought about what he needed to say for 2 days. He had drafted it in his head during the drive this morning and revised it during the walk from the car to the townhouse door and revised it again in the 30 seconds between Callum's appearance at the doorway and Diana's entrance into the room. He had wanted it to be exactly right. He had wanted it to carry the full weight of what it was meant to carry without tipping into sentiment or formality or the kind of careful language that made genuine things sound managed. What came out was simpler than any of his drafts. "She was wanted," he said. "From the night she arrived in my house, she was wanted. Decir, You asked that question 6 years ago and no one answered it, and that was wrong. I am telling you now." He paused. "She was wanted. She has always been wanted. And what you did that night, what it cost you to do it, has not been invisible to me, even when I didn't say so." Diana looked at him for a long time without speaking. Then she said, "You kept her safe." "Yes." That was the answer I needed then. She looked at Lily, who was listening to all of this, with her hands quiet in her lap and her dark eyes steady. "This is the answer I needed now." The room held that for a moment. Lily looked at Thomas. "Can she come back?" she asked. "Not every day, just sometimes." Thomas looked at his daughter and then at Diana and then back at his daughter. "Yes," he said, "if that's what you'd like." "It is," Lily said, with the definitive simplicity of a child who has located what she wanted and is now simply reporting its coordinates to the responsible adults. Harriet set a cup of tea near Diana's elbow without comment. Diana looked at it as though she had forgotten that ordinary things like tea existed in the same world as this afternoon. And then she wrapped both hands around the cup and held it the way you held something warm when you had been cold for a long time. Lily turned to her. "No more standing outside the fence," she said. Diana met the child's gaze. "No more standing outside the fence." "And no sneaking," Lily said. "No sneaking." Lily appeared to consider whether there were additional terms. She looked at the doll, then at Thomas, then at the tulips, then at Diana. "You can come through the door next time," she said. Diana's eyes filled again. This time one tear escaped before she caught the rest. She nodded. "Through the door," she said. "I promise." Lily accepted this with a small, satisfied nod. Then she turned to Thomas with the expression she wore when she had settled an important matter and was ready to move on to the practical implications. "Can we have the shortbread now?" Harriet, who had been standing near the tray with the composure of a woman who had held herself together through considerably more than she would ever be given credit for, made a sound that she covered with a brief clearing of her throat. Edmund, near the bookcase, looked at the ceiling for a moment. Thomas said, "Yes, we can have the shortbread." The afternoon shifted, and not into ease exactly, but into something looser. The formal weight of the first hour began to distribute itself across the room more evenly. Lily ate 2 pieces of shortbread with the focused pleasure of a child who had done important work and earned a reward. Harriet poured more tea. Edmund remained near the bookcase, but his posture changed, settling from professional witness into something approaching a tired grandfather at the end of a long day. Diana sat in the straight-back chair with her tea and watched Lily, and answered the questions Lily asked her, which were specific and considered and occasionally startling in their directness. She asked whether Diana had a dog. Diana did not. She asked whether Diana liked strawberries because she herself was uncertain about strawberries. Diana said she liked them very much, which Lily received as interesting but not decisive. She asked whether Diana had ever read the book about the fox because she herself had opinions about the fox's choices in Chapter 3 that she had not finished explaining to Harriet. Diana had not read the book. She said she would like to, which was the correct answer. Thomas sat in the armchair and watched his daughter conduct this quiet, methodical project of understanding another person through small and specific questions, and he recognized it as the same thing she had been doing to him for 6 years, building a map, taking measurements, deciding through accumulated detail rather than single impression what kind of person she was in the presence of, and how much of herself it was safe to extend in that direction. Lily was careful with her trust. She always had been. She gave it in increments, checking at each stage whether the ground was solid before moving forward. It was one of the things about her that had always struck Thomas as belonging to a part of her history that preceded Caldwell Estate, some early knowledge of uncertainty that had made her inherently precise about where she placed her weight. He watched her now placing it carefully incrementally in Diana Cole's direction, and understood that this was not a transaction that could be managed or protected into a particular outcome. It was simply going to develop the way things develop between people who were willing to keep showing up with honesty. That was going to have to be enough. And watching Lily watch Diana, he found to his own genuine surprise that it was. The meeting ended without ceremony the way good endings did. Lily had grown quieter in the last 20 minutes. Not unhappy, only the particular quietness of a child whose resources had been fully and completely engaged for several hours, and who was approaching the natural boundary of what an afternoon could hold. Harriet saw it first and began the gentle, efficient process of gathering their things without making it feel like a retreat. Lily stood when Thomas stood. She picked up the doll. She looked at Diana, who had also risen, who was standing near the straight-back chair, with her hands at her sides, and the expression of someone who understood that this was the end of this particular afternoon, and was trying to receive that fact without attaching to it everything it had taken to arrive here. Lily walked to her. She held out the doll. Diana looked at it, then at Lily, a question in her face. Lily shook her head slightly. "Just for a minute," she said. "Like before." Diana took it. She held it against her chest. Lily placed her hand on it briefly, the same gesture as before, both of them holding the same worn and mended thing for one short moment. Then Lily took the doll back. And then, with the quiet precision of a child who has decided what is right and does it without looking for approval, she reached forward and placed her hand lightly on Diana's arm. Not a hug, not a performance, a touch, considered and deliberate and offered freely. Diana went very still. "You can come back," Lily said quietly, through the door. Then she turned and walked to Thomas and took his hand, and they walked out of the garden room together through the townhouse hallway, past Callum at the door, and out into the West Village afternoon. The street was its ordinary self. A man walking a large, unhurried dog. Two women with coffee cups talking outside a shop doorway. The sound of a delivery somewhere around the corner, the familiar percussion of a city that had continued its rotation entirely unaware of what had just happened in the garden room of a brick townhouse on this particular block. Lily walked beside Thomas to the car. She did not look back at the townhouse. She held the doll in one arm and his hand in the other, and she walked with the steady, slightly tired purposefulness of a child who has come a long way in a single afternoon. At the car, Thomas crouched to her level. He looked at her face, the same face he had looked at 6 years ago in his entrance hall, asleep in Harriet's arms, one tiny fist wrapped around this same doll. He had looked at it that night and made a decision that had become the best decision of his life. And he had not known then that the decision was only the beginning of something, not the end of it. He knew that now. "You all right?" he asked. Lily thought about it honestly, the way she thought about everything. "Not the same as before," she said, "but all right." He touched her face once lightly. "That's enough," he said. She nodded. She got into the car. 1 week later, on a Sunday that arrived with the particular warmth of a spring that had finally committed to its own season, Thomas and Lily and Diana sat together in a park 3 blocks from the Riverside townhouse. It was the kind of park that Manhattan managed occasionally against its own nature, a stretch of benches and old trees and spring tulips along the paved path where children ran and old men read newspapers, and nobody moved very fast. Edmund Hale had suggested the location. Harriet had packed a small bag with lemonade and napkins and a container of the shortbread that she pressed into Thomas's hands at the door with an expression that made elaboration unnecessary. Harriet herself had found a bench 30 feet away where she sat with a book she was not reading and watched the three of them with the quiet attention she had been applying to this household's well-being for more years than Thomas sometimes remembered to be grateful for. Lily sat between Thomas and Diana on the bench. She had the doll in her lap. She had lemonade in a paper cup beside her shoe. She was looking at the path ahead, where two sparrows were conducting a disagreement about a piece of pretzel with a seriousness that she apparently found interesting. The conversation had been light in the way first conversations were, when the heavy things had already been said, and what remained was the ordinary work of learning how a person moved through the world. Diana had told Lily about the laundromat below her building, which Lily had found practically interesting and asked several questions about. Lily had told Diana about the fox from Chapter 3 with considerably more detail than the story probably required, And Diana had listened with the genuine attention of someone who understood instinctively that the fox was not really the point. Thomas had said less than either of them. He had sat with his shirt sleeves rolled to the elbow in the spring warmth and watched his daughter conduct her careful incremental project of understanding, and he had let her do it without intervening, which was perhaps the most difficult and most necessary thing he had done all week. After a while, Lily looked up at the old trees lining the path. "Miss Harriet says some people are part of your life by promise," she said. She was speaking to the air in front of her, not to either of them in particular. "And some are part of your life by blood." Thomas looked at Diana. Diana looked at Thomas. Neither of them spoke. Lily was quiet for a moment. A man walked past with a bicycle. Two small children raced ahead of their mother toward the fountain at the center of the park. Then Lily picked up her lemonade cup and held it in both hands and said with the settled certainty of a child who has thought something through to its furthest point and found what is waiting there, "I think I got lucky in a sad way." Thomas placed his hand over Lily's on the bench. Diana placed her hand beside his. Not touching, not overlapping, simply there in proximity in the same shared air, on the same wood bench in the same spring afternoon, present together, in the way people were present when they had been honest enough with each other to stop pretending that presence was something they could afford to withhold. The park continued its unhurried life around them. Sparrows, bicycle wheels on pavement, the remote sound of a church bell somewhere. Harriet on her bench with her unread book. The tulips along the path holding their colors against the light. Nothing was resolved in the way resolutions appeared in the stories people told themselves about difficult things. The poverty that had shaped Diana Cole's life had not been erased by an afternoon in a garden room. The years that had passed between a rainy entrance hall and an iron school fence had not been returned. The question that had gone unanswered for 6 years had been answered, but the cost of the delay lived in the answer's edges and would not disappear simply because it had finally been acknowledged. Thomas understood all of this. He was not a man who mistook the end of one chapter for the resolution of the whole. What he understood, sitting on this bench with his daughter between them and his hand over hers, was something smaller and more durable than resolution. He had spent 6 years believing that the right way to protect Lily was to hold the edges of her life tightly enough that nothing he hadn't approved could find its way in. He had believed this was love. He had not been entirely wrong, but he had not been entirely right either, and the difference between those two things had been standing outside a school fence for 3 mornings in a worn coat carrying a pink doll, asking for nothing, hoping for less. The protection had always been necessary. The tightness had always been too much. He looked at his daughter's profile, the braids with the blue ribbon, Harriet's work, the same every morning, the small daily declaration that this child was cared for. The serious, particular face that had been working its way through the largest questions of her life with more precision and less complaint than most adults managed. She had done this, he understood. Not him, not the attorneys and the security details in the correctly executed legal arrangements. Lily had done this by calling from behind an oak tree on a Tuesday morning, by insisting on meeting Diana properly by standing in a garden room and holding out a worn pink doll with both hands. 6 years old, finding the door that the adults around her had spent years either guarding or standing outside of and simply opening it. He looked past Lily to Diana, who was watching the sparrows on the path, with an expression he did not have words for, something between exhaustion and relief and something newer and less certain. The expression of a person who has been let back into a room they had believed permanently closed and is not yet sure they know how to live in it again, but is willing to try. He thought about what she had said on the phone 2 days ago. "I have been very careful for 6 years not to want more than I had a right to, but I am not going to walk out of it again. Not if she doesn't want me to." He thought she would keep that promise. He thought, with the careful, evidence-based optimism of a man who had learned not to reach conclusions before the data supported them, that this was the beginning of something that could be built into something. Not the same shape as what had existed before. A different shape, harder in some places and more open in others, requiring more attention and offering less certainty, but built on the foundations of what had actually happened rather than what everyone involved had found it easier to pretend. That was worth something. That was worth quite a lot. Lily finished her lemonade. She set the cup down on the bench beside her. She looked at the tulips along the path for a moment, then down at the doll in her lap, then out at the park's ordinary Sunday afternoon life, continuing its patient rotation. She leaned very slightly against Thomas's side, just slightly, just enough to feel him there the same way she had felt for him in the garden room, without looking, reaching back with absolute confidence in the knowledge that he would be exactly where he was supposed to be. He put his arm around her. Diana looked at the path ahead, at the sparrows who had resolved their dispute and were now engaged in something more cooperative, at the tulips, at the old trees with their spring canopy beginning to fill in properly, the way trees did when the season finally arrived, and stopped pretending to hesitate. After a while, without looking at either of them, she said quietly, "Same time next Sunday." Lily looked at Thomas. Thomas looked at Lily. "Yes," Lily said. And the afternoon held them there, all three of them on a bench in a park, in a city that continued its complicated and indifferent life in every direction around them, while something that had been broken for 6 years sat in the spring light and began without ceremony or guarantee the long and necessary work of learning what it could become.